This tutorial is going to show you how to create a mitered border on your quilt top. This is especially useful for borders that might use a stripe or an image that would look better continued around the corner rather than chopped off and turned. What's important to remember as you're cutting your border strips is not too much about the width. You can do any width of border, but you do want to make sure that you cut them long enough to account for the mitered corner. What I mean by this is when you lay out your quilt top, your borders should overlap each other. So for a quilt with 4 borders, you will need to add 2 border widths to each side to get enough length to account for the mitered border. To get started sewing this on, we're just going to fold the one border back, and we're going to flip the border to the quilt center, right sides together. Now the easiest way for me to start this is to actually flip the quilt top over so that I can pin those seams. And as I'm working, I just want to make sure that I'm not shifting and that I have enough border to work with when I get to those mitered corners. Now it's good to note here that the project I'm working on only has 1 mitered corner, so I'm just doing 2 borders. So don't be thrown off by my short border end here. That will just be trimmed to be flush with my quilt center. And if you're seeing the grid on the back of my quilt and are curious what that's all about, you can use the link below to check out my tutorial on creating a quilt top using a fusible gridded interfacing. Now, before you get excited and get ready to sew, I want you to take a moment, grab an erasable fabric marker, and mark a 1/4 inch line away from each edge. So if you are doing a quilt with 4 borders, which most of you probably are, make sure you do this on all 4 corners. This is the key to your success, because what we want to do is stitch down and away from those lines, meeting right in the center of this X. We don't want to sew past. So now you're ready to sew. So we're just going to make sure our edges are lined up, and I'm going to put my needle down into the center of that X, making sure to not go backwards. I do want to do a back stitch here, so I'm going to go forward a couple stitches and really carefully do a little back stitch just to hold everything in place, because we're essentially creating a Y seam and I want it to be nice and strong. So I'm just using my 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew the border onto the quilt center. And then again, remember my project is only using 1 mitered corner, so when you get to that bottom corner, you will once again stop right in the center of that X that you drew. We'll return back to our cutting table and lay out our next border. So you can see that we left a 1/4 inch open, which is perfect. So we will overlap these borders just like we did before. And we're going to make sure that there's a little bit extra, just it's easier to work with. And then flip it right sides together with your quilt top. Once again, it's easier to flip this over for me so that I can see my quilt top instead of the borders, because that's also where I marked my corner. And we're going to carefully pin, again, making sure we don't lose that extra border for the mitered corner. We'll head back over to the sewing machine again, and again, for 4 borders, you're going to go from center of X to center of X. So I'm going to show you how to come up to it instead of starting from it this time. And what you want to do is make sure that you're going to the center of the X and not running over the existing border. So you can kind of pull that out of the way, or just pay really close attention so that you don't hit that seam. Make sure things stay nice and flat and lined up as you're doing this, and take your time. So I'm going to creep as close as I can. I'm going to hit the center of that X and then back stitch, making sure to not hit that border. And as you open it up, you'll realize you just made a really nice little Y seam. Next, you need to head to a space that is large enough and flat so that you can lay your whole quilt out without any interruptions. This is really important because it's how we'll get a really perfect angle across your quilt to get the mitered borders. So, if that means the floor or the kitchen table, clear it off and lay out your quilt top. We're going to fold the whole quilt on a 45-degree angle straight across the center. So what will happen is that your quilt center will be folded on a 45-degree angle, which we'll check in a second, and your borders should be mirror images of each other. Take your time and get this right because this really makes all of the difference. Once you think you've gotten everything lined up, I want you to take a long ruler and find the 45-degree mark. You want to line this up with a row of stitches or a seam, and then line your straight edge with the 45-degree angle on your quilt center. If that 45-degree mark lands nicely on the seam and the edge is still straight with your edge, then you should be ready to go, and you can use your erasable fabric marker to continue that 45-degree angle from your quilt center onto your quilt border. If it doesn't line up, take the time, readjust until things line up perfectly. And then to keep everything in place, use a couple pins along the line that you've drawn, just so that that border doesn't slip. Carefully take your quilt over to the machine and get everything aligned so that your quilt center is folded out of the way, and you're starting right at the point where all of those seams meet. You're going to carefully sew along that drawn line and make sure to backstitch ever so carefully at the beginning and end of your work. And I always like to just kind of give it a once over to make sure I didn't run over the opposite side of the border or miss something. Now that we're back at the cutting table, we're going to fold all of our quilt top out of the way and just trim for a 1/4 inch seam. And I can't emphasize how important it is to make sure that your quilt top is out of the way. So we're going to line up our 1/4 inch mark on our ruler with the stitch line and trim for a 1/4 inch seam. Now that this is all trimmed up, I'm going to head over to my iron. I'm going to press everything towards the border, and then I will actually press the seam of the mitered corner. I'll press that seam open. Now, I really want you to take a moment to check your work. If your quilt top is looking more like the one on the left with a very pointy corner and a wavy, kind of lumpy border, you need to go back and redo your work. Now, before you despair, you have too much fabric, so you don't really need to rip off the border and start over again. All you need to do is pull out the stitches on the actual diagonal corner piece and redo that part. This typically happens when you might not have the space to lay the whole quilt top out and get it flat, or maybe your ruler slipped while you were drawing on your 45-degree angle, which is actually what happened to me, and you can see it earlier in this video if you rewatch it. I want to encourage you though, this is a fairly common problem and can be fixed easily. Just make sure to check your work and do one corner at a time. So once you have one mitered corner down, you can repeat this process on all 4 borders. If you love these fabrics and want to learn more, just keep watching this video and I will tell you all about my new fabric line called Modern Vintage Treasured. This fabric line, designed by me for Benartex Fabrics, is all printed on 100% unbleached cotton and is Oeko-Tex Standard 100 certified. This creates an exceptionally soft quilting cotton. With colors like dusty blue, off-white, and terracotta, you're sure to love any quilt that you make with this line. Today I showed you how to accomplish a mitered border in my trellis twist pattern. To find the fabrics or explore patterns, use the links below or visit www.rachelrossi.design.